Let's talk about Guyanese Creole as a language and not as broken English, as some people say.
Exactly. Yes.
Why can we say that it's a language?
It is a language because anything that two human beings can use to exchange ideas, information, feelings, thoughts, desires, and communication has to be a language because it has to have some kind of system. Without a system, we cannot communicate. If I say, man did dog beat, and somebody says, dog beat man they, and somebody else says, Uda pida bam be there they dog, we can't communicate. Correct? So we have been communicating in Creole. Our foreparents or grandparents have been communicating in Creole. And the only way they could have done that is one, if they have words. Two, if once you have words, it means that they have meanings. Three, those meanings and words are put together in sentences. Four, those sentences can be changed to show past tense and present tense, and singular and plural, and continuous and non-continuous, right? Five, those sentences can be changed to say, I am doing this, and then you are doing that. And in those things, they can talk about the moon, the sun, the stars, about their work. They can court the other sex and get married. They can bring up their children. They can talk about measuring land and building houses. They can go to work and earn money and tell you how much they earn, and so on, and so on, and so on. And they could have friends. They can quarrel. They can fight. They can cuss one another. They can compliment one another. They could sympathize with one another. They can congratulate. They can apologize, right? They can make requests. They can make demands. They can order you around, right? They can pray to God, right? They can make recipes, okay? So it is a language. Now, where people get hung up is, again, people get hung up on English because, as I said, English was the model and the thing that was put over our heads. So when we see W-A-L-K-I-N-G, walking, and then you see a Chinese people say, awak, walk.
Miawak.
Miawak, right? Say, no, that can't be. That is broken English because you don't have ing. But the fact is, ing is a system within English. A plus walk, a plus a verb is a system within Creole.
Creole, right.
For comparison, Spanish says Casablanca. Spanish puts the adjective, you well know this, right? After the noun, in many cases. But we do not say that Spanish is ungrammatical. Do not compare Spanish with English or English with Spanish and say one of these two languages has to be wrong. We recognize that Spanish has a system and English has a system, but we do not recognize that Creole has a system because the system is different. The Creole system is quite different from the English system. The English system is one in which you take like verbs, you take words and you modify them. So you take a noun and you add S. You take a verb and you add ing, right? Or you take a verb and you add ed.
Right.
Creole system is that you take separate words. So you take the verb, but you take another word. So you say walk, which means walking. Or you say a walk, was walking.
Okay,
right? Or you say two by, right? Instead of saying two boys. Now, if you want to talk about language and good language and bad language and so on, I can be facetious, fairly facetious, and I can tell you that English people are really backward because they have to say two boys are. They have to say it 3 times.
They pluralize it 3 times.
Yes. But we say, once you say two, you know it got to be
plural.
So why do I have to say boys and why do I have to say are? So I say two by come, two by the he, two by a walk. You already know that 2 boys is more than 2. So if I tell you, give me $1, you'll give me $1. If I say, give me $2, give me $10, give me $100, you know from the number
Right.
how much I'm telling you. I don't need you to tell me dollars are. Now in Spanish, you even pluralize the article and the adjective.
Right.
So you say what? Los dos casas blancas. Los dos.
Las dos casas blancas, right.
Good. Las, yes. So you have 4 times you are marking the language in plurality. In Guyana, you say two White House, right? Okay. Now, what we don't, part of the problem too is lack of knowledge and education, not just belief. Now, when I tell my students the history of Spanish, the history of English basically, how the English tried to make their language look scientific and philosophical in the 18th century, 17th and 18th and the 19th century, when England was emerging as an international power. And they changed the spellings to the Greek and Latin spelling with the neoclassical movement, right? The French went through the neoclassical period. The English went through a classical period. When they took their words and their language, they took their grammar and they tried to make it look like Latin grammar, right? And Greek grammar. And so when the English started to create their education system and they started to write the grammars to teach the children in school, people like Bishop Loth and Nesfield and those persons who are writing the grammars hundreds of years ago, England did not have a system then. So the only model of grammars they had were Greek and Latin models that had preceded the English civilization. And so when Bishop Loth wanted to write his grammar to teach the English children, he looked back to Latin, to Virgil and all of these guys. And he found out how they describe their language and the different parts of speech and so on. And he took some of them and he modified some of them. And he wrote the grammar of English. And that is why we have some of these complications in English language today. But we now, by the time we came into the picture with the English from the 1800s, they already had a written grammar. They had a language that had settled down, and they passed that language on to us. And they passed that on to us, and we took it as the God-given language, right? And then we took that, and we took our shame and our second-class mentality and so on. And we continue to say that it doesn't have a grammar, you know? There are many people on the internet, as you were saying, who perpetuate this and they preach it very vigorously and they get very worked up. But English has things like 10-foot pole. Like how we have 2x, English got a 10-foot pole, not a 10-feet pole. And you say toothbrush, you don't say teeth brush. Correct?
Right.
So there are traces in English of those kinds of quote-unquote ungrammatical things.
But yes, so very, very, very interesting. And you gave us, some history there. But we live in Guyana, as you said, English is the official language.
Yes.
And of course, Creolese, as we say, it's our language. So, and the way the country, the system is set up, we have to use English for certain, in certain settings.
Yeah.
But then let's talk about code switching and what some term Diglossia, let's talk about how those play out in Guyanese society.
Okay, good question, yes. Now, so you're quite right. And I must say that regardless of all I've said about English, it is a language and we must recognize it. It has world status and world power. And it is the international lingua franca, the language that is used internationally. So we cannot say we're going to abandon English. So the issue here is not to say condemn English, but the issue is understanding English and its history, that English has a history also that people had to create. Now, that's another thing. We don't know that English, people had to sit down and write it, and people like Chaucer and Shakespeare had to invent a spelling system and so on. English had to be invented in a written form. And from all the different people speaking English, they had to agree on a form or a form had to emerge that could become international English and so on. So you are quite correct. Now, English has great advantages for Guyanese. It allows us to be in contact with the world. It allows us to access the world, all the books, all the internet and all of that, and so on. And any language, not just English, French, Patois, Yoruba, Patamona, Swahili, opens up a new culture and new ideas and possibilities and so on, right? So English does that for us. But we are born in a Creole-speaking environment, and what we have to do is to value the Creole, understand it, understand that we are at a very important stage that the English went through many hundred years ago. We are now at that stage of valuing and probably standardizing our language, finding a way of writing it, and so on and so on. So in this kind of situation, as you said, we switch between languages, or we switch among languages. And one of the major code switching now is between Creole, any version of Creole, and what we know to be English or what we think to be English. Mm-hmm. And so we have kind of divided up our activities into formal activities and informal activities, things in which we need to be sounding more like English, and things in which we don't need to be sounding so much like English. So like if we were to go on the radio to do a broadcast, to read the news, or like on a program like this, we automatically, without thinking about it, we know that we switch to a particular language. So that is a large amount of code switching going on in Guyana. And all Guyanese do that code switching, depending on their abilities, because not all of us have the same ability in English. And as we were saying before, the Creole has many different varieties also. And many of us have different varieties of Creole. So that exists. Now, some people used to call it, but before I go to that, there's also code switching in Creole also, because we can switch from basilectal Creole to mesolectal Creole, or we can switch from a more formal kind of Creole to a more informal kind of Creole. We can switch from a friendly kind of Creole to a less friendly kind of Creole, and we can do the same in English. So we can code switch from one language to the next, or we can code switch from one variety of a language to another variety. So we can code switch in English, and we can code switch in Creole, or we can switch from English to Creole, or from Creole to English. Okay. Now, there is a claim, or some people claim that there's a diglossia in Guyana, and a diglossia or a diglossic situation is where you have a socially strict separation between two languages or two varieties of a language. But the point is that traditional diglossia is where you have one language that supposedly has a longer tradition, that has a written literature, that has a more classical form, and so on. And so that is called an H or the high variety, and that is reserved for things like education, court, broadcasting, ministerial discussions, university, and so on. Okay? And certain formal gatherings, public lectures, and all of that. And then you have another variety of the language that doesn't have such a long history, that doesn't have a written literature, that is not regarded as a classical language. And so that is used for unofficial purposes, informal purposes, talking to your family, talking to your friends, close relationships, and so on and so on. So that's called a low variety of the language. That is classic diglossia. Mm-hmm. Now, that kind of exists to some extent in Guyana, and we use English as the H variety, and we use Creole, Guyanese Creole, as a low variety. But the thing is, because our Creole has such a close association with English, the boundaries between English and Guyanese Creole, like when I said talk instead of speak, right? The boundaries are so close that sometimes we're really speaking a Guyanese Creolized kind of English when we think that we are speaking British Standard English, which we don't have access to nowadays. Right? So we can draw the lines of classical diglossia, but then when we do the sociolinguistics and we do the field work and we see how Guyanese people really interact and behave linguistically, then we can see whether a diglossia or a modified kind of diglossia. Now, some people talk about a stable diglossia. We have a strict separation between the H and the L. And some people talk about an unstable diglossia, where, you know, people can sometimes switch or sometimes don't switch, or the boundaries are not so clear. The boundaries are fuzzy. Okay? So you might find something like that happening in Guyana, or you might find something different happening in Guyana, right? Now, another interesting kind of diglossia that occurs in Guyana is seen among the East Indians, where you have, when we go for religious purposes, we have a different language. So I might speak my Creole or English, but when if I go to the mosque or I say my prayers, that activity, Arabic or Urdu, is reserved for that activity, right? And the Hindus, when they go to their temples and they pray and they sing their bhajans and so on, they do it not in English or not in Creole. They do it in Sanskrit and Hindi. Okay? So that's called like a functional diglossia, right? And when you find it, when Muslims, I don't know about the Hindus, but Muslims, even Christians, when they go to church, they address one another sister or brother or something like that, right? It's just one term. It kind of, that person you might see in your village, and you might call the person John or Mary or whatever nickname the person has. But in church or in the compound of the church, you call the person brother something or that, right? The Muslims do the same thing. They say Baha'i, you know, or something like that. The Hindus do it, Baha'i somebody. So we have a different form of address that is more religiously oriented for that particular kind of occasion, right? So that's like a kind of functional diglossia, a functional diglossia, right? But diglossia, classical diglossia, the important thing is that in classical diglossia, you would create offense, you would cause offense if you were to use the H where you should use the L, or use the L where you should use the H. So if you were to speak to your wife in a formal manner, she might think that something is wrong. Or if you go and you speak to your boss in an informal manner, he or she might be offended. So, but I don't think in Guyana you have offense. If I were to go to court and speak in a kind of Guyanese Creole, people might notice it, right? But I don't think they will be offended. I don't know what you think.
Well, they might not be offended, but maybe they might think, they might say, he didn't know any better. Or maybe he can't speak English. Maybe that's all, you know, and they might say, he comes from the Baghdad or something. Something,
right.
You know.
We will stereotype the person, right? But you see, even within that situation, the recognition that the occasion is one in which you need to use another form of language is important. So I might say, what happened thereby, you know, or something like that. But in another occasion, I might say, what happened thereby? I might try to change my language to as formal as I can get. Right. Because remember, we said the Creole has different varieties. And even in English, Now, you see, we tend to think that everybody in England speaks British Standard English. But you might find some speaker of English who lives in some part of England who doesn't speak standard dialect English, but has a formal occasion and moves his dialect towards a more formal variety, but doesn't achieve the formal variety that the speakers of that variety know, right? But the point is that the speaker recognizes that he has to try to speak, quote unquote, more formally.
Right. Mm-hmm. Yes.
Yeah. So we have the social expectations. Yeah.
So just to clarify, what is the correct, okay, we talk about, should we say Creolese or should we just say Guyanese Creole? What, is there a correct way of referring to our language?
Yeah. Excuse me. There isn't a correct way, but what is happening is that, as I said, we are now in the period of I don't want to say stabilizing. We are now in a period of doing what we need to do to make our language recognized, accepted, known, and used. Okay? So one of the things is now to what to call it. So we've been calling it Creole, we've been calling it English, we've been calling it Creolese. The term that many people are using now in linguistic circles is Guyanese Creole. Mm-hmm. Probably to keep in touch with Jamaican Creole, Barbadian Creole, Surinamese Creole, and so on. Because the Caribbean is like a kind of a panlectal area, an area where you have a kind of English Creole that is kind of similar and different, right? At the same time, you have similarities and differences. So I think the term that people are using now is like Guyanese Creole or GC, or GCR, something like that. Creolese is still being used. But you see, Creolese is also an adjective, a descriptive term for any Creole, right? It can be used as a kind of description for any kind of Creole across the world.
Okay.
Right? So to give, and then the other thing is, if we say Guyanese Creole, you put the name of the country on the language.
Okay.
You can say British Standard English. You don't say Standard English.
Right.
British Standard English. American English.
Mm-hmm.
You put the name Guyanese Creole. So people can identify it and know where it comes from and what kind of language it is and so on. So that might settle down in a few years from now.
But tell me, do you think we'll ever... Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
When we write academic papers now, like a paper I'm writing right now, we say Guyanese Creole, and we put in brackets GC. Mm-hmm. And throughout the article I'm writing, I say GC and Guyanese English also GE, the version of English that we kind of use internationally and so on. Mm-hmm. So those terms we are using in academic papers and conferences and so on.
So do you think we'll ever get to the parts we're going to get to place like Belize or Jamaica in terms of our Creole and having it in written form and more recognized?
Yes. You know, at the university, we have a unit now called the Guyanese Languages Unit. Right. And there are people, like Charlene Wilkinson and Tamara and Diglossia and Seneca Henry and others. And I am also work with them sometimes. So what they're trying to do now is to do all of this kind of work. You see, we put that aside so that instead of that getting into all other kinds of linguistics, that can focus on Guyanese linguistics. And they came up with a Guyanese spelling system. They took the spelling system that was used for Jamaican Cassidy-Lepage system. And then Mr. George Cave, many, many years ago, had modified the Cassidy-Lepage kind of system for Guyanese. And then recently, Hubert Devonish did some more revisions on it. And then I think the Charlene and Dr. Diglossia and Seneca and the others did some more tweaking of it.
Okay.
And so we now have a spelling system.
Okay.
And not only that, but we are now involved, we're now putting that into our classes and what we teach people and so on. So even though it's not a course in Guyanese Creole, like in sociolinguistics, Creole linguistics, first-year linguistics, and so on, we make sure that students know about this alphabet and can use it and all of that. So people are now being able to. And in the paper that I'm doing right now, when I'm writing about Guyanese Creole, I use that spelling system.
Mm-hmm.
So there's going to be a paper published somewhere that is going to have a Guyanese spelling system for Guyanese Creole. Right? So through these ways now, the language gets a foothold. But it has to start with us, you know. We have to recognize it and value it and so on.
Right. Yes, exactly. So one other point we could talk about is before we end off is what are some of the things? I mean, I think you did mention some of them as we went on in terms of the erosion, but I wanted to ask, well, what are some of the things that you would say that erode the Creole and those things that help to maintain Guyanese?
Yes, right. I was just going to raise that. So you've raised it. Yeah, erosion of a language happens when people don't use it, they don't value it, they have a negative attitude to it. So they can be like a kind of internal erosion. And I believe that is what happened among like the Amerindians, the indigenous people, where the elders stopped speaking the language, didn't pass it on to younger people. Among the East Indians, that happened, where the Bhojpuri or the Arabic or the Urdu, except for religion and some survivors in the names of foods and objects and relationships and so on, those things were not passed down to us, right? I remember my parents sending me to madrasa, but that was to learn the Quran, the Arabic in the Quran, and that is based on Quranic texts and so on. And then the Hindus also have, I forget what they call it, a kind of school where, you know, little kind of classes where they teach the language and all of that. But to teach it as a living language, was not done. Okay, so internally, if we don't pass it down, if we allow things like Nancy's story and games and riddles and proverbs that are actually done in the language, if we allow those things to disappear, then the language is going to be eroded. If we tell our children speak properly, as you had mentioned earlier, right, and we don't value it, it's going to be eroded. If we don't allow it to be perpetuated in schools, we're going to lose it, and so on. So there are some internal factors. Now, the opposite of those would be maintenance factors. If we use it, recognize it, value it, pass it down, grandparents speaking to grandchildren and speaking to their children in that kind of language. You know, we make sure that we have riddles and we tell stories, and we have it on the radio, and we have newspapers and so on. We have a spelling system and we use it. We have a dictionary or dictionaries, grammar books, and so on. All of that will have to preserve the language. Now, there's some external factors of erosion. External factors like the cultural imperialism that I spoke about also. Things like radio, television, internet, books, fashion, and so on, coming from abroad, wrapped up in a kind of language. International trade. Now, why would I want to be a self-employed person in Guyana when I can be an international trader, right? To be an international trader, then I need to know English. So I would go and learn some English. So that kind of thing would help to erode our language, external factors. Things like economic development is a two-edged sword. All of this development with Exxon and oil and so on can be a two-edged sword. because it could impose another kind of culture. For example, foods. We could have large supermarkets opening where we get strawberries and mushrooms and zucchini and broccoli. I know many people are now using broccoli more than bhaji.
Yes, I see what's going on again. I know they're even importing bread. I'm like,
importing
what?
bread and importing breadcrumbs, right? And now, you see in my class, in my social linguistic class, I discussed it with my students. And they said there's a restaurant that caters for the Guyanese high flyers and the foreign clientele. And cassava bread is described on the menu as rainforest pancake.
Yeah, I saw somebody wrote about that on Facebook, yes.
Yes. And roti is becoming flat
bread, yes.
Right? And curry is becoming, meat stewed in a sauce. and something, simmered with coconut and curry leaves and so on. Right? So you see, that can kind of lead to some cultural erosion. Mm-hmm. And then when our young people want to get jobs in the local foreign offices, right? You already see some language changes. Sound American, they sound hip and American.
I noticed that on the radio a lot. It's like everybody has an American accent.
Right? So that could lead now to erosion. Those kinds of factors could lead to erosion. So maintenance would have a lot of work to do. Erosion, doing with other languages and attitudes to languages and so on, right? The media, the radio, the television, the newspapers have a great role to play. We don't see enough like Creole programs. And if it's a Creole program, it's like a special program, on the television or on radio, or a special box in the newspapers. So that kind of thing. So lots of factors. Languages like Guyanese are always under threat, right? Because of our second class, but I'm not saying it is second class, but the way in which we are put into like a second class, second level. Now, conversely, these economic developments might help to springboard Guyana and might help to springboard Guyanese culture. So economic development might have a positive spin. So more people might come to Guyana, more people might know about Guyana, more people might want to know about Guyana, more people might now value roti and curry and cassava bread, right? And more people might want to eat bhaji. We might find a way of incorporating bhaji into American dishes and, using bora instead of string beans, right? And so we could have now an influence from Guyana to the rest of the world. Mm-hmm. But our leaders have to do it. Our business people have to do it. Our teachers have to help to promote, set the base for it. Our young people have to hold on to their culture and not just be swept away into Americanisms and so on and so on and so on. Right? So there's lots of cultural, and it's good that your program there. Let me give you a big up and a shout out. All right? Yes. Things like this. I should mention that programs like this would help to maintain culture. Now, for example, people should be able to see me and you talking in not British Standard English, and we can talk Creole and we can talk Guyanese English.
Exactly.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
And we can broadcast it around the world, and it is still an intellectual discussion. It is still a heavily important cultural discussion that has great implications for the future of Guyana. Right? So let me big you up and give you a hail up and a shout out.
All right. Thank you. And this has been so such an education. So even though I see myself as a linguist, I still, I learned a lot too today, listening, and I'm hoping that everybody who watches this program learns from it. And let's learn to value our Guyanese Creole. It's not broken English. We haven't broken up the language. This is our thing. This is our culture. And but I noticed from what you said, we really have a whole lot of work to do to really let people really see the value of this language and really accept it and use it. It's a lot of work. And, we do have some people who are doing other things to promote the language. And I've had a couple of them on this program already, like Dr. Pauline Beard and the young Glasgow Douglas, Dr. Pauline Beard with What Is Story Said, the young Glasgow Douglas with Our Story That Melody. And
I didn't mention the whole literature in Creole, novels and books and so on written in Creole.
Yes. So we have a ways to go, but we're going to work at it because we know this is an integral part of our culture and we don't want to lose it. So as we close, is there anything new, any final words, Alim?
Yeah. Well, first of all, thanks to you for having me and allow me to talk for such a long time. And thanks also to you for having such a program and having those kinds of persons that you mentioned on the program. The bad thing is that even though we speak for 2 hours, 1 hour, 3 hours, we're really scratching the surface. Mm-hmm. There's so much that we can talk about that we can go on and on for a long time. And we need to talk about language, not as something separate, but as part of history, part of culture, part of life. And we need to make that connection. And we need Guyanese people to have a better sense of history, their own Guyanese history, and also the history of European countries and African countries and Asian countries and so on. For my purposes, the history of European countries, how they emerged, because European countries are such a big powerhouse in the world nowadays, but they came from the same place that we came from, starting something from scratch, right? Another important thing is that we are doing our ancestors a great injustice if we do not value the Creole language. Because this is something they created. They were not linguists. They didn't have schools. They didn't sit down and take pen and paper. They didn't hold a conference, right? They didn't consult dictionaries and books. They didn't have internet. And they were under tremendous physical pressure and tremendous social pressure, right? And yet they developed a language that allowed me to become a linguist, you to become a professor, other people to become authors, people to become presidents and prime ministers and businessmen. We came from all of them. And the only way that we are where we are is because we came from our parents through all of that history. And it would be a bad thing, an injustice, something, an injustice to our foreparents if we were to not try to learn about their language and our language and to value it and to try to make sure that it is sustained, preserved, maintained, continued, expanded, developed. It will change. All languages change.
Languages change, right, exactly.
Yes.
As long as it's living, it will change, yes.
Exactly, yeah. So that is what I'd want the listeners to take from this program, and for them, each one of us, to do some work into building this. And we are now at a moment where we have the things right to get it done. So we have to build from here. So as I said, I can go on and on and on, but I will stop here.
All right. So yeah, maybe another time we talk some more.
Yes.
Thank you so much,
of course.
Alim.
I much enjoy that.
Yes, for being here, and thank you for the work you're doing, and and the others who are working there in the Guyanese. You said it's Guyanese language unit.
GLU,
University of Guyana. Yes, and then we're gonna get it out to the rest of the country, of course.
Yes.
So thanks again. And thank you to the viewers for watching. We're going to see you soon as we meet new people and share their experiences on the next episode of Our Culture to the World. Thanks, Alim. Bye.
Okay, thank you. You're welcome. Bye. Bye, everyone.